In our last episode, we followed Freemasonry through one of the most turbulent periods in British history, as England and Scotland were torn apart by the Reformation, civil war, dynastic conflict, and religious persecution. Masonic lodges transformed from medieval craft lodges, once purely practical institutions of working stonemasons, into influential civic and social spaces by the 17th century. We explored how waves of religious refugees, particularly Huguenots fleeing persecution in France, helped reinforce ideals of tolerance within the lodges, while political upheavals from the English Civil War to the Glorious Revolution and the failed Jacobite Rising of 1715 reshaped the social and ideological landscape of Britain. Out of this chaos emerged two competing cultures, one tied to Tory and Jacobite traditions emphasizing lineage, honor, and chivalric symbolism, and another aligned with Whig, Enlightenment values centered on reason, constitutional government, and religious moderation. It was these tensions that eventually led to a bold solution, the creation of the Grand Lodge of London in 1717. By uniting lodges under a single authority and redefining Masonry as a moral and philosophical fraternity rather than a political or sectarian network, the Grand Lodge sought to stabilize society itself. Through standardized governance, symbolic ritual promoting universal morality, and a commitment to unity over division, Freemasonry transformed into what we now call speculative Masonry. But institutions do not create themselves. In this episode, we turn our attention to the men behind that transformation, the founders, thinkers, and organizers who shaped early speculative Freemasonry. Who were they? What motivated them? And how did their personal politics, beliefs, and ambitions leave a lasting imprint on the craft as we know it today? But before we dive, please hit subscribe. The accession of George I in 1714, the consolidation of the Hanoverian Protestant succession, and the failure of the Jacobite Rising of 1715 heightened anxieties about loyalty, order, and social cohesion. In this fragile climate, a small group of Hanoverian Whig loyalists hatched a plan to use the established and influential Masonic lodges of the day to once again bring unity and stability to Britain. By uniting all Masonic lodges under the control of a single Grand Lodge and a new philosophy now known as Speculative Freemasonry. By uniting previously independent lodges under a single administrative body, the emerging Grand Lodge would preserve ritual, hierarchy, symbolism, initiation, secrecy, and a language of moral honor, elements that appealed strongly to aristocratic and chivalric sensibilities and resonated with men shaped by older Tory and even Stuart cultural ideals, while carefully stripping these traditions of explicit dynastic or partisan allegiance. In doing so, the craft retained a sense of dignity, continuity, and ancient lineage without posing a political threat to the Hanoverian state. This transformation unfolded gradually and intentionally, beginning with meetings in 1716 at the Apple Tree Tavern, where representatives of several London lodges agreed to, quote, revive annual assemblies, quarterly communications, and the election of a Grand Master. These efforts culminated on June 24, 1717, St. John the Baptist's Day, when a lodge meeting at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern in St. Paul's Churchyard in London took place, along with lodges from the Crown Ale House, the Apple Tree Tavern, and the Rummer and Grapes Tavern. All four lodges were simply named after the public houses where they were accustomed to meet. The Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard, now called Lodge of Antiquity No. 2. The Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane off Drury Lane. The Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, Covent Garden, now called Lodge of Fortitude and Old Cumberland No. 12. And the Rummer and Grapes Tavern in Channel Row, Westminster, now called Royal Somerset House and Inverness Lodge No. 4. While three of these lodges retain strong links to operative traditions, the lodge meetings at the Rummer and Grapes, situated near the Palace of Westminster, attracted civil servants, clergymen, intellectuals, and gentlemen whose interests lay not in stonework but in moral philosophy, sociability, and governance. And this lodge would quickly become the most influential within the new Grand Lodge, reflecting the broader shift to speculative Freemasonry. It was at the Goose and Gridiron that the four lodges formally constituted what became the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. The first Grand Master elected was Anthony Sayer. Little is known of him, and it appears to have been a neutral and largely symbolic choice, placing the oldest Master Mason in the chair. However, it seems that more capable administrators behind the scenes were the true architects. Who were the true masterminds behind the Freemasonry we know today? The first was George Payne, a senior civil servant in the tax administration whose professional experience shaped the institutional character of the Grand Lodge. Payne recognized that unity required regulation, and under his leadership Freemasonry adopted written rules, elected officers, standardized lodge governance, regular minute-taking, and majority decision-making structures that closely mirrored parliamentary practice and reflected Whig constitutional ideals, transforming the craft into a disciplined corporate body capable of expansion without fragmentation. Payne served twice as Grand Master, in 1718 to 1719 and again in 1720 to 1721, and during his second term he authored the General Regulations of a Freemason, which required lodges to keep minutes, maintain accounts, submit to centralized authority, and operate within a standardized framework. These regulations marked a decisive break from the informal customs of older operative lodges and laid the foundation for Freemasonry as a modern institution. Very little is known of the period from 1717 to 1721, due to lack of minutes and written material, but sometime during this period it was the Reverend Dr. James Anderson who was commissioned to write the constitutions of the Freemasons, containing the history, charges, regulations, and of that most ancient and right worshipful fraternity, for use of the lodges. According to Anderson, he was commissioned to digest the old Gothic constitutions of Freemasonry. The book was submitted for approval to the Grand Lodge and published by order of the Grand Master in 1723, with the addition of the outgoing Grand Master's method of constituting a new Masonic lodge. Anderson's constitutions represented one of the most significant innovations in Masonic history. For the first time, the history, charges, regulations, and governance of Freemasonry were standardized and made widely accessible in printed form. While its legendary history tracing Masonry back to biblical times was criticized even in its own day, the book successfully redefined Freemasonry as an ancient moral fraternity rather than a medieval trade guild, aligning it with Enlightenment ideals and elite sociability. But it most likely was not Anderson who constructed this work alone. Alongside Payne and Anderson stood the man who was probably the most influential on modern Freemasonry, John Theophilus Desaguliers. It was Desaguliers, a clergyman, scientist, fellow of the Royal Society, and associate of Isaac Newton, who supplied the intellectual direction, symbolic depth, and public visibility that complemented Payne's administrative framework. Educated at Oxford after a difficult youth marked by poverty and self-reliance, Desaguliers embodied the Enlightenment ideal of merit, learning, and rational inquiry. He earned his living by delivering hundreds of public lectures on experimental philosophy, physics, optics, and astronomy, dazzling audiences across Britain and Europe with demonstrations that appeared almost magical while subtly teaching Newtonian science. Although Desaguliers served only one term as Grand Master in 1719 to 1720, he was the guiding intelligence behind the early Grand Lodge, directing the preparation of Anderson's constitutions by supplying the so-called Gothic constitutions from which the text was compiled and chairing the committee that approved them. It was most likely under the guidance of Desaguliers, who was the son of Huguenot refugees, that the constitutions first addressed one of the most persistent sources of instability in post-Reformation Britain: religious division. The Protestant Reformation had advanced the principle of sola scriptura, affirming Scripture as the ultimate authority for Christian faith, yet the resulting freedom of interpretation had produced a proliferation of denominations in deep sectarian conflict, and under Desaguliers, early speculative Freemasonry would emerge as a space where men from these divided Protestant traditions could meet in peace, requiring belief in God and reverence for Scripture while deliberately avoiding doctrinal disputes that had fractured churches and communities. By emphasizing moral instruction, symbolic teaching, and individual conscience rather than confessional creeds, Freemasonry honored the Reformation's commitment to Scripture while offering a practical framework for unity among Christians who interpreted that Scripture differently. Anderson's constitutions also affirmed loyalty to civil authority, satisfying Whig concerns about political stability while grounding Freemasonry in an ancient, universal moral tradition that transcended contemporary party politics and appealed to those drawn to older notions of honor and legitimacy. Crucially, the constitutions explicitly prohibited political and sectarian disputes within lodges, ensuring that men of opposing sympathies, Whigs, Tories, and even former Jacobites could meet on the level without threatening public order. And in this way the Grand Lodge did not eliminate ideological difference, but contained and neutralized it within a shared moral and symbolic framework. Following 1721, the Grand Lodge made a calculated political decision to elect only members of the nobility as Grand Masters. The first was John II, Duke of Montagu, who was a Whig aristocrat and celebrity in his time. It was in 1721 that the Grand Feast was moved from the Goose and Gridiron to Stationers' Hall in order to accommodate the several hundred people who wished to attend his installation. This move was not merely cosmetic. It aligned Freemasonry with the ruling Hanoverian establishment, shielded it from suspicion, and elevated its social prestige. Noble Grand Masters, many of them fellows of the Royal Society, served as public patrons, while men like Paine and Desaguliers continued to guide policy behind the scenes. The strategy worked. By 1725, lodges had spread far beyond London to cities such as Bath, Bristol, Norwich, Chester, and Warwick, with provincial Grand Lodges emerging in Cheshire and South Wales. Public processions accompanied Grand Master installations, newspapers reported on initiations, and Freemasonry became a visible feature of urban life. As Freemasonry rapidly expanded, the character of lodge life changed in ways that made the traditional pattern of work increasingly insufficient. Earlier lodges, especially operative ones, met irregularly and focused primarily on admitting new members, administering oaths, and conducting basic business. Even in the early speculative period, the core activities of making an entered apprentice and later passing a fellow craft were relatively brief ceremonies. Once lodges began meeting on fixed nights, at regular venues, and with growing memberships of educated gentlemen, it quickly became apparent that initiation alone could not sustain an evening's proceedings, let alone maintain long-term engagement among men who were accustomed to intellectual stimulation, polite conversation, and structured sociability. Desaguliers was already famous for his public courses in experimental philosophy, where he combined structured explanation with dramatic physical experiments to illustrate hidden principles of nature. It is therefore no coincidence that Masonic Lodge lectures in the 1720s and 1732 often mirrored the subjects and style of his public teaching. Records from lodges such as the Old King's Arms Lodge show lectures on astronomy, optics, the nature of light and color, mechanics, and the structure of the eye, topics identical to those Desaguliers taught professionally. In this way, the lodge became a semi-private extension of the Enlightenment lecture hall, where knowledge was shared among brothers in an atmosphere of trust, equality, and mutual respect. In practice, lodge lectures often blended scientific demonstration, moral reflection, and symbolic interpretation. Experiments that appeared almost magical, such as making heavy objects rise, cork sink, or oil descend in water, captured attention while illustrating natural laws, reinforcing the idea that hidden order governed both the physical world and moral life. This approach echoed the structure of Masonic symbolism itself, where visible forms point toward invisible truths. By incorporating lectures and demonstrations into regular meetings, Freemasonry created an intellectually vibrant lodge culture that could sustain frequent gatherings, satisfy educated members, and reinforce the craft's Enlightenment identity. It was in these early years that Masonry's most iconic feature began to take shape: its ritual. While the origin of the Masonic ritual will be covered most extensively in a future video, it is important to understand that prior to 1717, ritual practices varied widely and degree structure was fluid, generally recognizing only the operative grades of apprentice and fellow, with master functioning more as an office than a distinct initiatic step. It was Desaguliers, scientist, clergyman, Fellow of the Royal Society, and professional lecturer in experimental philosophy, who was positioned to supply both a conceptual framework and a pedagogical method capable of reorganizing Masonic ritual into a coherent initiatory progression. Under Desaguliers, ritual evolved, crystallizing into the three-degree system of entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, with the master mason degree and the legend of Hiram Abiff providing a powerful initiatic narrative centered on fidelity, loss, and moral restoration. By reconciling Enlightenment civic values with aristocratic ritual culture, equality with hierarchy, and rational morality with symbolism, the Grand Lodge transformed Freemasonry from a loose collection of local civil lodges into a centralized, bureaucratic, and broadly acceptable transnational moral fraternity, one that reflected the stabilizing aspirations of early 18th century Britain while laying the foundations for its global expansion. Across this series, we have traced Freemasonry not as a sudden mystery, but as an institution shaped by history. It began as a network of medieval craft lodges, civil institutions that regulated labor, preserved knowledge, and maintained social order. As feudalism declined and society changed, those same lodges adapted, gradually opening their doors to non-operative members and evolving into broader civic and social spaces. By the 17th century, Freemasonry stood at the crossroads of religious conflict, political revolution, and cultural transformation. The Reformation fractured Christian unity, civil war weakened absolute monarchy, and waves of persecution, especially among Huguenot refugees, introduced new ideas of tolerance and conscience. In a deeply divided Britain, lodges became rare spaces where men of different backgrounds could meet in peace. The creation of the Grand Lodge of London in 1717 was a deliberate response to this instability. By uniting independent lodges under a single authority, Freemasonry preserved ritual, hierarchy, and symbolic tradition while removing overt political allegiance. At the same time, it embraced Enlightenment ideals through constitutional governance, moral philosophy, and rational inquiry. Figures like George Payne, James Anderson, and John Theophilus Desaguliers gave the craft its structure, legitimacy, and intellectual direction. In doing so, Freemasonry did not eliminate disagreement, it contained it. By prohibiting political and sectarian disputes, the lodges balanced hierarchy with equality, tradition with reform, and faith with reason. The result was speculative Freemasonry, a moral fraternity capable of stabilizing society rather than dividing it. Freemasonry endured not because it stood apart from history, but because it learned how to reconcile its tensions, and in doing so, it developed into an institution that can still stand as a beacon of hope and unity in times of strife and division. Be sure to subscribe to Digital Lodge #1 for more information on the history and philosophy of Freemasonry.